Hey there, fabulous biology students. Today I want to talk to you about the all-important topic of reproduction. And we're going to start with a general view and then move on to the human reproductive system, which is going to be the focus of our talk today. In order to understand sexual reproduction, you have to really understand what asexual reproduction is, which is the evolutionarily more ancient form of reproduction. In asexual reproduction, an individual produces offspring that are genetically identical to itself. Single-celled organisms do this by a process called binary fission, otherwise known as cell division. All prokaryotes reproduce this way, asexually. It can also happen in eukaryotes. For example, many single-celled eukaryotes do it, as well as budding in coral, which I'll show you later, or runnings and cuttings in plants, and I'll show you that as well. Here's the general idea. You have a parent cell here. The nucleus divides, and then the cytoplasm divides, and you have two daughter cells, and they are genetically identical. That is asexual reproduction. But here's what happens in coral. You'll have a little polyp here. This is an animal called the hydra, and it will grow a little bud, as it's called, off the side, and eventually that ends up looking like a little mini hydra, and eventually it separates itself and becomes a free-living organism. And so this process is called budding, and I've always wondered if that's why a lot of parents call their children Bud. I don't know. It's just a guess. Here it is in plants. You can see that plants can send out a runner, and then that runner can root, and that can be an above ground runner, as in this example here, or in this mint, an underground runner where new plants spring off. That's asexual reproduction in higher plants. And here's asexual reproduction on the afternoon talk shows. I'll let you take a look at that. That's asexual reproduction. So what does sexual reproduction means? Well, the idea is that two parents recombine their genome to make offspring that are different from either parent. And so this means that haploid gametes must be produced, and that the fusion of gametes will then create a diploid zygote. And then that zygote divides by mitosis to become a multicellular organism. The big question that biologists still debate is, why did sexual reproduction evolve? And it seems to be, the best answer seems to be, that it's a compromise between maximizing reproduction of your own genes and creating the variation needed in an offspring to survive a changing environment, either in the future or over the course of a year. So it seems to be a bet hedging strategy. We want to focus on human reproduction here. And what we want to do is understand the anatomy and the physiology that leads to successful gamete production and successful zygote formation. And we're going to start with males, and then we'll go through females. So here is a picture of the male anatomy. You have a blank diagram like this, hopefully, that you can fill out as we go. And I'm going to start where the sperm are produced and then end up with where they leave the body. So we're going to start right here. And here you see a testicle inside the scrotum, and the testicle produces sperm. These sperm mature in this weirdly shaped thing on top of the testicle called the epididymis. And once they've matured, they're stored in this long tube called the vas deferens. And they wait there until ejaculation occurs. When ejaculation occurs, there is the seminal vesicle adds fluid, and here is the prostate right here, and that adds fluid. And then the bulbourethral gland adds some things to it as well, and we'll talk more about this. And it goes out the urethra and heads towards an ovary, or not. Let's quickly go over the formation of sperm. Testes is where sperm is formed. Hopefully you're looking at your diagram. The epididymis is where, once made, the sperm matures and then hangs out or moves into the vas deferens until it is resist. The vas deferens, which is also sometimes known as the ductus deferens, is a muscular tube that stores and carries mature sperm. Seminal vesicles provide liquid for the semen. This liquid contains fructose, which feeds the sperm. It's a sugar. Proteins and mucus, and has an alkaline pH. And why would you have an alkaline pH? Because the vagina is acidic, and the vagina is acidic to prevent its invasion by hostile bacteria. And so that acidic vagina is hostile to sperm as well, and so the alkaline sperm increases the pH in the area where the sperm is and allows the sperm to survive. The prostate produces most of the fluid in the semen, and it contains enzymes, proteins, and other molecules that are just designed to support the sperm. And finally, the ejaculatory duct is where the vas deferens joins the urethra, and then the sperm travels out through the urethra, which is a long tube from the bladder to the tip of the penis. Here's what a sperm looks like. You can see it's very simple. It's got a nucleus, it's got a ton of mitochondria in what's called the middle piece, and it's got a flagellum or a tail that propels it forward. So that's the structure of a sperm. Now, one of the most amazing things about human biology is the number of sperm per ejaculation. The average male ejaculates 2 to 5 milliliters of sperm, or cubic centimeters if you prefer that measure, and each milliliter contains about 100 million sperm, so I'll leave you to do the math there. And my favorite male biology fact is that when male sperm count drops below 20 million per milliliter, infertility sets in. So at 20 million, that becomes too few to guarantee the ability to have children. That's incredible. And what that means is that when sperm get into the vagina, as they're all racing for the ovary, they're dying in droves, right? Most of them are dying, and a few of them are making it through. And I think of those battle scenes where everybody's getting mowed down, and like the hero makes it through and wins the day. And there's that one sperm making it through, fertilizing the egg. Or not. Hormones become very important in sex cycles. You've probably heard about this, and it's true for males as well as females. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the female hormones, but let's for a second talk about the male hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers that are produced in one part of the body and cause a cellular response in another part of the body, and they flow through the body in the bloodstream. An organ that produces a hormone is typically called a gland, and the important glands for the sex cycles are the hypothalamus and the pituitary in the brain, and the gonads. In males, new sperm is made in response to an ejaculation. So a male ejaculates, and now the body has to make new sperm. In females, the hormones cycle in a monthly basis to produce a single egg that is released each month. In this picture, you can now see a lot of the important glands in the body, the major, what are called endocrine glands. And you can see that we have the testes and the ovaries. Now, one individual does not have both. They either have one or the other. And then the hypothalamus and the pituitary are up here in the brain. And those are going to be the ones that are important for the reproductive cycles. The hypothalamus releases a hormone, GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that stimulates the pituitary to produce two other hormones called FSH and LH. So these hormones stimulate the testes to produce testosterone and therefore sperm as well. As the testosterone levels rise, there's a negative feedback on FSH and LH, which were stimulating more testosterone and more sperm formation. So the rate at which testosterone is produced and sperm are produced starts to slow down. And then after sperm is released, testosterone levels drop. The hypothalamus sees that, sends the GnRH to the pituitary. The pituitary produces FSH and LH, which cause testosterone to be produced in the testes, which then promotes sperm formation. This is a straightforward negative feedback loop. Low testosterone stimulates FSH and LH production, which in turn stimulates testosterone. And once the testosterone is back, then the levels of FSH and LH fall. Meanwhile, sperm has been produced and is ready to be ejaculated again. So, that's it for the male reproductive system. Let's move on to the female reproductive system. Here is a cross-section of the female anatomy, and I'll do it the same way as I did last time. You should have a blank diagram that you can fill in. Eggs are produced in the ovary. They travel down the fallopian tubes into the uterus, and you have to imagine that there's another ovary coming out of the picture here towards you, and there's another fallopian tube coming out of the picture also. So they will put an egg into the uterus, and here's the uterus. Now the uterus will accept the fertilized egg, and that is where the embryo will develop. If the egg is not fertilized, it'll be flushed down the vagina and out during menstruation. We'll talk about that. I just want to show you one other thing. Here is the urinary bladder. And you can now understand that as this gets large with an infant during pregnancy, why pregnant women have to urinate so often, right? Because that embryo is pressing on the bladder. Ovaries produce eggs and hormones. The hormones the ovaries produce are estrogen and progesterone. There are about 1 million immature eggs per ovary. One haploid egg is produced per monthly cycle. Now, during embryogenesis, which means when a woman was an embryo in utero, the eggs are developed to prophase 1 of meiosis, and then development is suspended until puberty when they mature individually with each monthly cycle. Now, a female might be reproductive from 15 to 45, let's say, so that's 30 years, and let's say 13 cycles a year, so you can do the math, 13 times 30, and you can see that only somewhere around 300 to 400 eggs out of the million in each ovary mature during the lifetime of a female. The ovum is huge compared to a sperm, about 75,000 times larger. And it is released by the ovary, and then the cilia on the lining of the fallopian tubes move it down towards the uterus, much like a rock star is passed overhead in a concert. How about that for an analogy? The egg is typically fertilized in the fallopian tube, so the sperm makes it all the way through the vagina into the uterus and down these horns of the uterus into the fallopian tube and find an egg in there. And mitotic division begins immediately. There is no waiting period. And in the human embryo, I believe it's cell division about once per hour. So I want to stop and do an aside about human sex for a second. So the first thing is sex happens. And this is personally why I think that you have to have a plan beyond abstinence. Sex in human beings is not expressly for reproduction. There are all sorts of other reasons that humans engage in sexual behavior. And so it's simplistic to say that sex is about reproduction. That is simply untrue. Sex requires learning, and there are all sorts of good resources out there for learning about sex, all sorts of good books. But one of the places not to learn about sex is from pornography. So I highly recommend that not be your sexual education. Sex is risky. There is disease risk, there is pregnancy risk, there is risk of using birth control in some cases, and there is emotional risk. But these risks can be managed with intelligence, compassion, and technology. So you should be aware of that. Sex is socially complex. Every society has a different take on sex, and you cannot assume that somebody who's grown up in a different culture or even subculture from you has the same view as sex as you do. So this is someplace that sex needs to be talked about. Sex is also biologically asymmetric. Males can walk away from sex without having any change in their biology happen, whereas females, if they get pregnant, have a huge change in their biology and have huge decisions to make at that point. So it is a biological asymmetry. And to me, as a biologist, that is really important in helping me form my moral universe. And finally, sex in humans is a fascinating evolutionary topic. So, for example, we are the only great ape that has permanently enlarged breasts in the female. We are the only great ape in which ovulation is concealed, and we are the only great ape to have a huge penis. Those are all evolutionary topics, and they're fascinating, and I encourage you to study them in the future. Okay, now back to our regularly scheduled biology class on reproduction. The mechanics of sex are pretty simple. Sperm is introduced into the vagina, and it travels through the cervix and the uterus into the fallopian tube, where fertilization either occurs, a zygote is formed. The egg immediately begins to divide by mitosis and travels towards the uterus. In the uterus, the fertilized egg embeds itself in the uterine lining, where it will develop through a process of embryogenesis that will take 38 weeks. There's an amazing set of structures, particularly the placenta. We are, after all, placental mammals, that form to support the growing embryo. And that's a topic for another course, but really amazing. During birth, the baby passes through the cervix, which dilates to about 10 centimeters. And the baby gets out through that 10 centimeter cervix at that point. Normally, the cervix is only about half a centimeter to a quarter centimeter open. And then it goes out of the vagina as well. Pretty impressive. So let's now talk about the female reproductive cycle. So the female reproductive cycle is controlled by hormones that prepare the body for accepting a fertilized egg. The hormones are produced either in the brain and target the ovaries, or in the ovaries and target several locations, including the brain. There are two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, that we're going to focus on, and there are also cycles of hormones in the blood, which I'm going to have you look at, but you will not need to know the level of detail about the cycles in the blood as you will about the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. The ovarian cycle develops and releases the egg and has 3 phases that we're going to study. And the menstrual cycle prepares the uterus to accept the fertilized egg. So we're going to start with the ovarian cycle, and then we're going to finish with the menstrual cycle, and then we'll be done. Okay, so this is a common graph. You're going to see it in a number of forms, and it shows the gonadotropins, those hormones, the ones that are released in the brain. It shows the ovarian hormones, the ones released in the ovary. It shows the events happening in the ovary, and this is often the same as the ovarian cycle, and the events happening in the uterus, and this is the same as the menstrual cycle, which also has 3 phases. In the ovarian cycle, which is going to release an egg, the first phase is called the follicular phase. A follicle, which is an egg and its supporting cells around it, is released from the ovary in response to the release of a hormone called FSH, the yellow one here, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone. You can see its level was increasing here. So that causes the ovum to start to mature. The follicle itself then produces estrogen. So the follicle now acts like a little gland. And that further stimulates the follicle to grow, positive feedback. It stimulates the uterine lining to grow, positive feedback. And it causes the pituitary to secrete LH, another positive feedback. In the ovulation phase, there is a pulse of LH around day 13, day 14, and this causes ovulation. And in ovulation, the mature egg leaves the follicle. As estrogen is produced, FSH decreases from the brain. So this prevents more follicles from being developed. And as the follicle secretes more and more estrogen, the pituitary increases the amount of LH, and it finally peaks on that day 13, day 14, and causes the ovulation. LH, the luteinizing hormone, stimulates the completion of meiosis and causes the follicle to burst. So we're now through the follicular phase and the ovulation phase. Let us go on to the luteal phase, the third and final phase of the ovarian cycle. The LH causes the cells in the ruptured follicle to divide and form this body called the corpus luteum, which literally means the yellow body. I'll abbreviate it as CL. The CL now acts like a gland and starts secreting estrogen and progesterone, these blue and purple lines here. So you can see the estrogen goes back up, progesterone starts to be secreted. The progesterone then feeds back on the uterine lining and says, hey, eggs coming down the pike here, get the uterine lining ready to receive it. The estrogen and progesterone negatively feed back on these two, so no more eggs will be developed in this cycle. The corpus luteum can only live for about 2 weeks, and so if nothing else happens, if the egg doesn't get fertilized, the levels of progesterone and estrogen will drop when it disintegrates, and the uterine lining will be shed, which is known as menstruation. If fertilization does occur, then when the zygote plants in the uterine lining, or implants in the uterine lining, a new hormone called HCG is released, and that causes the corpus luteum here to live on, and therefore the levels of progesterone and estrogen stay high, and therefore no new follicles will be developed, and the uterine lining will be maintained. Here is the ovarian cycle in one diagram. The ovary never looks like this. This is like a time-lapse photography. So here we have a primordial follicle. Now it becomes a primary follicle. It's the one that's chosen this month, and it develops, and then eventually the follicle ruptures and the egg itself is liberated. The rest of the follicle becomes this corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is now emitting hormones. If after 14 days there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum decays into this body called the corpus albicans. The text here just says what I just said, and you can read that on your own time. Let me move on. Now let's talk finally about the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle's purpose, as I said earlier, is to get the uterus ready for a fertilized egg. It's driven by changing levels of estrogen and progesterone. At first, estrogen encourages the growth of the uterine lining, and then later progesterone does the same. So early in the menstrual cycle, after menses, that pulse of estrogen that's occurring as a result of the growing follicle causes the uterine lining to start to be reconstructed. And then later, once the corpus luteum is formed, progesterone causes the uterine lining to start to prepare. If fertilization does not happen, then estrogen and progesterone levels drop and the lining is shed. If fertilization occurs, then levels of estrogen and progesterone stay high and the lining is maintained. So let's go back and look at that on this diagram. Here you can see we have menstruation. And then by this point, the follicle is developing, and so the uterine lining starts to develop again. And then once this progesterone starts to be formed, you get a uterine lining reaching its maximum. Then once those two drop, it is shed once again, and that is the monthly cycle. Human women produce eggs for about 25 to 35 years, and the 25 years is probably closer to the average than 35 years, which would be pretty long reproductive life for a woman. And the cessation of menstruation with age is called menopause. So that's it for the female reproductive cycle. I hope, even though it's complex, you have stayed with it. You will have plenty of exercises in class to make sure you get the basics of this. And that is that.